Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to Tex-Trek. And while we don't have a podcast this week, I did want to share something with y'all that is not exactly Trek related, but I wanted to talk about NASA for a bit. In celebration of the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing, I recently took a trip to Houston, Texas to check out NASA at Space Center Houston, the official visitor center of the Johnson Space Center. Johnson Space Center, of course, being the famous home of NASA here in Texas. This is where NASA handles things like astronaut training, space travel research, and flight control. Remember the famous line from the movie Apollo 13, "Houston, we have a problem." When Tom Hanks's character Jim Lovell says that, he's talking to people at the Johnson Space Center. So this is a place where both space travel and the state of Texas meet, and even though, like I said, it isn't exactly Star Trek related, it still seems appropriate to talk about on the channel. So the first thing I want to mention is Space Center Houston seems very good for families. If you have kids old enough to be interested in real-life space travel and you're in the area, I would recommend going. There are a lot of interactive exhibits, a lot of learning opportunities. They even have live demonstrations where kids can participate and ask questions. Stuff like the basics of rocket science and the chemistry that goes into that are covered, as well as stuff like the cutting edge technology like the 3D printers used in space to create equipment for astronauts on the International Space Station. And speaking about this being good for kids, I actually visited one time before, back when I was a kid myself. My mom took me and my sister, I believe, 25 years ago, and I have to admit, it did feel more impressive back then than it does now, but part of that was just being an impressionable kid. I think there's still a lot there for adults to be interested in. There's things like a real Saturn V rocket. Basically, they have this big-ass rocket that was used on the Apollo missions, housed in a giant barn, and you can just walk all around it and look at it. This is where we saw a real-life astronaut giving a presentation. There are mock-ups of real-life spaceships, real spacesuits on display. There is a scale replica of the old Skylab station that you can walk in and tour. There is a scale replica of a space shuttle being piggybacked on a plane that you can walk through. And there's a lot of Mars stuff. There's a lot of focus on Mars right now. And there are tours of the Johnson Space Center where you can get on this tram that drives you around and you can see the buildings where people are currently working on things like the Orion spacecraft and planning manned missions to Mars, which is super cool, and more on Orion in a bit. But the drawback here is that you're really just riding around looking at buildings full of government employees, so that part is not as exciting. In fact, I would say the most exciting part about this tram tour is seeing some of the wildlife around there. The grounds of the Johnson Space Center are full of animals. We saw some deer and rabbits running around, but they wouldn't let me get any footage of them. We rode past these longhorn cows, though, who I was surprised to see there, but I guess that's just a reminder that you're still in Texas. We did go inside one real Johnson Space Center building and toured the astronaut training facility. And that is, to be honest, probably not as cool as it sounded. We just walked through this hallway in a warehouse and looked down through a long glass window at a bunch of what looked like spaceship parts that are used for training. We did see some folks working down there. We saw people messing around with one of the robots NASA is using. That was pretty neat. There's actually a couple of places where we saw them showing off this new robot, Robonaut, which is designed with human-like arms and hands so that it can perform the same tasks that some of the astronauts do in space. It can help out with some of that kind of stuff. Just be warned though, Houston is very hot and very humid, and the tram tour does require long waits outside. We would have toured a couple more buildings that they actually let you go inside of, like the astronaut training center. But we didn't want to stand around for another hour waiting in line outside in the muggy heat. But the coolest stuff there, if you ask me, is the Orion spacecraft stuff I mentioned earlier. I actually learned a lot about Orion, the latest big thing NASA is working on, and in collaboration with the European Space Agency. The plan is for Orion to be the spacecraft that takes us further into space than we have ever gone before. Orion will be used in the Artemis missions, which are already planned out, and the idea is to send astronauts back to the moon in the year 2022. That's just in 3 years, so this is coming up really soon, and I really hope it happens. And not only are we going back to the moon, but the plan is to construct a space station called Gateway that will orbit the moon, and from there we can launch missions deeper into space, including a planned mission to Mars in the year 2033, when the orbits of Earth and Mars sync up. I knew stuff like this was in the works, but I had no idea we were this close to any of it happening. I really hope all of this happens as planned and that us humans can boldly go where no one has gone before. But be sure to let me know what you think about it. Have you ever been to the Space Center? Do you have any desire to go? Do you have any questions for me? Leave a comment. And also, be sure to check out our coverage of all the massive Trek news that came out of Comic-Con a week ago. In our podcast, we discussed the news on all of that, from the epic new Picard trailer to the upcoming animated show Lower Decks and the information we got on that, to Anson Mount and Ethan Peck returning as Pike and Spock. You don't want to miss any of that. I'll have a link in the description to that podcast. And also, keep your eyes on the channel, because Sunday night we will hopefully be podcasting live from Star Trek Las Vegas with coverage of that con and discussion of any Trek news that we'll surely get during STLV. So thank you for watching, and until next time, live long and prosper, y'all.